Hi everyone, thanks for making the left turn for today, Saturday, August 25th, 2018. I'm George Farrar. Welcome back to the George Farrar channel. I've got a lot to talk with you about today. I have a special presentation here on the Left Turn Network, here on the channel. Welcome to Generations. Strength in numbers, baby boomers, millennials, X and Z. I'm going to talk a lot about the baby boomers, the millennials, and like everyone else, I'll just ignore Generation X. Just kidding. I'm Generation X, and towards the end of the show, I'll be talking with you about Generation X and the millennials. And I'll talk at the end briefly about Generation Z. I was born in 1975, and I have a lot of memories and experiences that have shaped who I am today. And I think it's time here on the channel to take a look at American history, a people's American history. Okay, looking at the times in which the boomers, I call the baby boomers, I call them the boomers, when the boomers were growing up, coming of age, what was going on. And we'll talk about that all the way up to around 1980 when I began to really start to see the world. And so I've got a lot to bring you. And, you know, this is not the first show that I've done about generations. Back in 2012, I had an incredibly popular presentation about generations. I talked about and focused more on the specifics of the economics and the needs and the wants of these different groups. This basic talk that I had, no pictures, just me sitting here in my living room, talking with you on camera, talking with you on mic today, but back then, I just sat down and had a conversation, I guess, a monologue, but online, there were a lot of comments on this show that I did in 2012. It was uploaded in April of 2012. It has, as of last count, 6,336 views. My fourth most watched show on this channel. I think I struck a chord with people. My thoughts on Generation X, the greatest generation, boomers, millennials, and economic reality. Now, I got a little bit more deep into the economics and talking about what motivates people. Let's take a look historically at things, because the baby boomers, where did they come from? Well, the United States of America and the Western Allies won World War II. Here we see Emperor Hirohito surrendering to General MacArthur off the coast of Japan. Okay, this is Las Vegas in 1955. We're going to start to see America as the baby boomers began to grow. Okay, men and women that survived World War II, after World War II, they had the opportunity to grow a family. Okay, and so everything's really gets to going. Elvis Presley, we have the record industry. Los Angeles is growing. Okay, the Sun Belt is starting to grow. Dwight Eisenhower's our president. People are, at this time, people say people are wanting stability. People are building suburbs and living out in the suburbs. But there are issues. Even in 1957, Eisenhower had to send the National Guard to protect a black woman enrolling in a college. Then in 1960, President John F. Kennedy defeated Richard Nixon in a close presidential election. This was the 1960s. People, now at this point, my father, he was in Memphis, Tennessee, and he was about to go to Memphis State University. Okay, so he was in his teens, and so Kennedy is here. We see him signing legislation. Here we see him talking about civil rights. Okay, because there's yet another civil rights struggle that will be happening. Here we have George Wallace, the governor of Alabama in the early 1960s, standing in the way of a court order to admit African Americans. Here we see President Kennedy and Vice President Johnson during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, we had concerns, nuclear concerns, that our way of life could vanish in an instant because a president and the premier of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, so we had space going on, John Glenn, but then he orbited the Earth. But then there was that fateful day in Dallas, Texas, November 22nd, 1963. John F. Kennedy was assassinated in front of his wife, Jackie, in the presidential limousine. Okay, this was a trauma upon the country, and the assassin was himself assassinated by Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner. Okay? And the country mourned. And I can remember my father talking later on with me as I grew up about the Kennedy assassination. It really stuck with people, okay? I remember the Space Shuttle Challenger exploding in 1986. I remember, of course, 9/11, September 11, 2001. But this was the baby boomers 9/11. This was the Kennedy assassination. And it was a big thing. And LBJ was sworn in the jet, the presidential jet. And Martin Luther King starts marching in the 1960s. And this is a march in Selma, Alabama, people fighting. But not only were people fighting for civil rights, people were being drafted. Young men, sons, brothers, were being sent to Vietnam to fight the North Vietnamese. Pictures were starting to come back on television. Television news, people didn't like what they saw. Also, people were coming back deceased, dead, killed in battle. People didn't want to go to war anymore, and people began to protest. People began to burn their draft cards. Now, my memory is just simply growing up as I came of age in the early 1990s. I just had to fill out a postcard, okay, and I got a confirmation back. I filled a form and I got a postcard back from Selective Service. Okay, different way of living back then. Times were raw. There were, at this point, President Lyndon Johnson decided he would not seek another term as president. So this threw open things, but as all of this was starting to happen, Martin Luther King, the civil rights leader, was assassinated. Riots in Memphis. I can remember my grandfather talking about how they went down to get my grandmother because she was working at a department store called Gerber's, and people were rioting, okay? They were rioting in the streets. And then Senator Robert Kennedy killed, assassinated. Richard Nixon defeats Hubert Humphrey, okay? A lot of unrest. Richard Nixon promises law and order and has a secret plan to win the war in Vietnam. We managed through all of this, though, to keep on with the innovation. Neil Armstrong, United States citizen and astronaut, lands on the moon, July 20th, 1969. Now there is a great time to party, and a time as the country is growing to celebrate. And the country's growing, the interstate system's building. Not only have we built the space program, but we are, in our own way, building technologically a new frontier. Now, Kennedy talked about space as a new frontier, and we still, even to this day, talk about space as being our frontier. But there's going to be something that's going to go on that's going to be very, really neat as things develop with communications. Now, in 1969, Nixon had promised, he had a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. Ultimately, though, Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor, and him, they worked out a plan where they were going to widen the war. They were bringing down the troop levels, but they were not going to pull out completely. They were going to do something called Vietnamization. They were going to, with these drafted kids in Vietnam, still keep fighting, but pull out, and ultimately they would be in Cambodia, bombing Cambodia. Okay, so all this is going on. Well, it's starting to happen. This is 1969. This is August 1969. This is an exit, I believe, off the New York State Thruway. They had to close down the New York State Thruway in August 1969 because of a little concert called Woodstock. And back then, there was no internet. There was no Facebook. There was no Twitter. You couldn't just sit and watch some live stream of a concert. If you really, and there were concerts, of course, at different coliseums and arenas and things like that. But what was really getting the baby boomers and people going were these big festivals. Earlier in the 60s was the Monterey, I believe there was a Monterey Festival, Monterey, California. Okay, Jacksonville later on in the 1970s had some neat concerts. Okay, but here in New York State, Jimi Hendrix is performing to this huge crowd of people. And guess what, my friends? These are the baby boomers that have come of age. And certainly, of course, look at it as older people too. And, younger even. I mean, you have to look at things differently. But now all of this is happening. Everyone's had some fun. But in 1973, there's an OPEC embargo, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, a long name for saying the oil barons, okay, the people that ran the oil markets. And so they started rationing gas, and they started saying you can't drive so fast now, okay. So you had this big youth, this big push through, this big everyone's going to go out there, and live the American dream. But then Watergate happens, President Nixon resigns, the economy starts to dive, okay? I read a lot about history. There were a lot of closures of small businesses. The inner city began to deteriorate even more. And we have Richard Nixon, and he leaves, okay? He escaped the impending threat of impeachment. Not impeached. He just simply resigned when he began to realize the writing was on the wall, and Republicans, including Senator Barry Goldwater, 1964 Republican presidential candidate, went to him and said, listen, okay, it's time to resign. And so along comes August 1974 into 1975, and we have a new president. We have Gerald Ford. He had been appointed vice president. He lost re-election. He was an honorable man, but he pardoned Nixon, and people remembered that. Now, again, let's think generationally, okay? These people now, are they're working, right? We get the development of young urban professionals, and people finally have kind of gone, okay, I want to get my career going. And so in the 1970s, things are somewhat uncertain. The economy is pretty rough, and we have a governor from the state of Georgia who was elected our president in 1976, an honorable man, a good man in his heart, who tried to do the best he can, or the best that he could, Jimmy Carter. But his presidency is beset by the economic stagflation, that's inflation and recession, and you have that mixture, and it begins, of course, to decrease his political capabilities. Okay, he wanted to throw a lot in to fixing America, but he didn't do some of the political things in the political ways that certain people wanted, right? Along comes President Ronald Reagan. He defeated Carter in 1980, and he's the first president that I really remember. I remember President Carter from in the late 1970s, but only briefly. President Ronald Reagan will have quite an impact on the country. He'll serve for 2 terms, and he'll actually survive an attempted assassination of him in March 1981. Okay, so he survives that. He actually manages politically to survive a very deep recession. And in time, the economy gets better. Now, I always say with the economy, it's relative. Okay, the cities did not come back. The urban cities did not really come back in growth. Crack, the drug crack, cocaine, that began to ravage the cities, the inner cities. Now, amidst all of this, in the 1970s, I was born, and here I am as a youngster in the late 1970s with my father. Probably this would be around, maybe 1976, maybe 1977. Okay, so here's the point where I really stopped talking as much about the politics and the culture that's going on. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about myself as Generation X. Okay. Now, by this point, people weren't having as many kids. And so I would grow up in Jacksonville. I would live in a neighborhood called Arlington. Later move on to another neighborhood called Mandarin. And then moved out to the west side. And so I would start to come of age experiencing everything that the 1980s and early 90s would have to offer, and would graduate Forest High School, now known as Westside High, on the west side of Jacksonville, in the year 1993. Here I am. That's my senior picture. He most lives, who thinks most, feels the noblest, acts the best. That was my senior quote. Okay. So, in the 1990s, I really liked Nirvana. Big things were going to start to happen. I was going to go out to Florida State University, okay? And the internet came along, all right? Now, as people like to say, that is something for another story. So I'll go ahead at this point and announce that I do want to talk later on in the programming schedule on this channel specifically about Generation X, where I focus on the 80s and the 90s. And I talk from my perspective. Generation X has been dramatically ignored, and it's quite insane, but I definitely understand the reason, the numbers, the money that's involved. But one thing you do have to keep in mind, and here's just a little nugget from this little snippet I pulled out here, from 2007 to 2010, Generation X lost 45% of its wealth, okay? I keep trying to really say, when I talk about the economy, is, we are a product of the times in which we live. I can't necessarily just go off for 6 months and experience the world in my situation, but a good number of people can't either. Things like student loans, debt, adult responsibilities, right? And some people have taken later on in the generations, okay, have taken longer to be with their parents and to grow up, okay? That's a simple fact. It's out there. And I'll start to talk about the millennials, and I want to talk a little bit, though, about, there's a lot of words up here on the Generation X board here. We look at Generation X as being born in the mid-1960s to the mid-1980s. Independent, assertive, multitaskers, skeptical, cynical, team players, adaptable, pragmatic, open to change. That's very much true, I believe, particularly in my work. And also, too, I look at it with American society. Okay, I've seen a lot of promises, and I've seen a lot of promises not kept. I've seen a lot of talk and a lot of glam, and I haven't seen action or push through behind it. But, this show, I called it Strength in Numbers, yet we haven't really talked a lot about numbers. We've talked about the protests in the past. There's a lot that generations can do to work together. Remember the civil rights era and all the people that were involved. A lot of this stuff is multi-generational stuff. And, you're going to find, you don't want to make sweeping generalizations out there, okay? But here are some facts here. I think you see certainly a difference more with Generation X. Here I am sitting, and I'm doing a lot on the PC, okay? Generation Y, mobile, everything's smartphone, everything's streaming, everything's laptop, and I'm sitting here at my monster computer and my monster television set going, behind all of my equipment here, going like, okay, And latchkey kids, I was, for a period of time, my stepmother went off to work and I had a key, and then I lost the key and my dad understood and he changed the locks and everything worked out, okay? Television. Think of smartphones these days as television. Okay, but think of it differently, because you have a multi-mode communications. Okay, so there are some differences. I think there's people that there's a way of looking at things. The older you get, the more you see, and the older you get, if you're smart enough, of course, that is, you can pass on certain advice and certain cautions out there to generation. We call it Generation Y, millennials, and to ultimately to Generation Z as Generation Z starts to approach. Generation Z being born in the mid-90s, okay? Knowing everything as the internet, okay? For me, the internet was something that was plugged into the Stroger Library at Florida State University, and the state spent a pretty penny on it, and their investment was well earned. They got a lot out of their investment. I learned email, I learned internet, I learned how to communicate. But I also, for a moment here, want to just, for a little bit of fun, say, listen, we need to cut some of the negativity off against millennials, Generation X. And I can tell you, Generation X were slackers, the Generation X, slackers, lazy. All you want to do is just listen to Nirvana and lay out on the couch and watch Jerry Springer. What are you doing for American society? Where are you? What are you doing? And right, you're right. You're right. I will admit I spent some time on the couch, but you have to look at strength in numbers. And here's we go to economics. People go, why are people not really going, going to Applebee's? Okay, why are millennials not eating enough mayonnaise? Okay, companies, industries are looking like, okay, we have this age bracket that's coming through that is really starting to be an impact. Look back at the baby boomers, okay? Music, television, concerts, okay? So I'm going to get somewhere with this, and it may take me a couple shows. But in strength in numbers, remember, you have an economic strength in a large group of a generation. You have shared experiences. A lot of people do, coming-of-age experiences. And I think that we see in the civil rights and with the war in Vietnam and how people fought to end the war in Vietnam, to bring peace and to bring an environmental movement, it took numbers. Right now, the millennials, I think, if you find some sympathetic Xers and baby boomers and silent generation, which, guess what? I've been somewhat silent on the silent generation, but they're a factor out there. We can all come together and change the world. Some of our politicians have fallen short. Some of our politicians have been shot. Some have survived and some have died. But leadership is among a whole different groups of people, and you have to take your skills, your capabilities, and you have to put it somewhere. And I think Generation Z is going to show us a lot, I think, by having been encompassed fully in the internet and going into the smartphone, the internet generation. But can it not fall apart? Yes, it can. People can believe in things, and here we have a civil rights leader. We're looking at Martin Luther King, assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968. April 1968. Think of all that happened after 1968. And this was before I was born. I'll be born in the mid-70s. I was born when the economy was really at the depths. And, I guess you could say about, 4 or 5 years out from the moon landing. And people were beginning to question things. But we have running through us young people, middle-agers, old people, a streak of innovation that, when harnessed with talent, with education, with communications, can accomplish a lot. Okay? So I leave you with this thought, and I think that if people made an effort across the generations to communicate out and to try to break down the barriers, the millennials aren't doing this, and the Generation X is spending too much time on the couch, and people aren't saving for retirement. It's also what you also to look to focus on. So when you're driving down the road and here's the Dames Point Bridge in Jacksonville, Florida, and just remember when you're driving, multiple generations, different people, everyone's buzzing to and fro. But ultimately, we are all in this together, if you think about it, because people have called Generation X a bridge. You know, a bridge over troubled waters. If we all remember that we're in this together, if anything ever happens, we can help each other out. So I think that there's a lot to talk about more. And I hope that you'll share this. I hope that you'll comment. I hope that you'll be understanding in what I'm doing with this medium. And, you know, it kept me off the couch for about an hour. So I hope it kind of got you to thinking. I want to thank you for watching. It means a lot. I know I don't put a lot here on the channel. I have my year-by-year series of Jacksonville. I want to do more. Things are going to start to heat up with politics. I want to talk about some endorsements. I want to talk about some things going on here in Florida and the campaigns, but all that's coming. It's coming. Just hang on there. Be you, silent generation, baby boomer, Generation X, Generation Y, millennial, Generation Z. Really, we're all Americans, and for those of you out there who aren't an American, you're watching internationally, we're still all in this together. So thanks for watching. Take it easy. See you later.